The courtroom buzzed with its usual tense energy as Judge Evelyn Hart took her seat, her sharp eyes scanning the room with undisguised impatience. She adjusted her robe with a practiced flick of her wrists, the movement conveying both authority and irritation at having to deal with what she undoubtedly considered another trivial case. Her reputation for being merciless, particularly toward defendants who didn't fit her idea of respectability, was well known among lawyers and defendants alike. She had built her career on a foundation of privilege and connections, never once doubting her own superiority or the righteousness of her judgments. That morning, the docket was full of the usual minor offenses: traffic violations, petty theft, noise complaints, the kind of cases that bored her but gave her ample opportunity to flex her power. She moved through them quickly, her rulings swift and often unnecessarily harsh, her tone dripping with condescension. The defendants, many of them poor or people of color, shuffled in and out, heads bowed, voices subdued under her withering gaze. She barely listened to their explanations, cutting them off mid-sentence, dismissing their pleas with a wave of her hand or a sarcastic remark. The lawyers, even the public defenders, knew better than to push back too hard. Then Marcus Johnson walked in. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, his dark skin weathered by years of hard work and sun. His clothes were clean but simple: work boots, jeans, a button-down shirt that had seen better days. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, his posture straight but not defiant, his eyes meeting the judge's without aggression but without fear, either. He had been charged with running a stop sign, a minor infraction that should have been a quick fine and nothing more. But Judge Hart took one look at him and her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. The prosecutor, a young man who clearly wanted to get through the morning as quickly as possible, gave a perfunctory summary of the charge. Marcus had been pulled over at an intersection where a stop sign was partially obscured by overgrown branches. The officer claimed Marcus had blown through it without stopping, but Marcus insisted he had come to a complete halt. There were no witnesses, no dashcam footage, just the officer's word against his. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he kept his voice calm and respectful. "Your Honor," he began, "that stop sign is hard to see because the bushes haven't been trimmed in months. I did stop, but I understand how the officer might be missed it. I've been driving for 20 years without a single violation." Judge Hart cut him off with a scoff. "Oh, here we go," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Another one playing the victim. The sign was hidden. The officer made a mistake. Do you people ever take responsibility for anything?" The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. The courtroom, which had been murmuring with the usual low-level noise of shuffling papers and whispered conversations, went quiet. A few of the lawyers exchanged glances. Someone in the back coughed. Marcus didn't react at first. He took a slow breath, his hands clasped in front of him. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "I'm not playing anything. I'm just telling you what happened." Judge Hart smirked. "Of course you are." She turned to the prosecutor. "What's the fine for this?" The prosecutor hesitated. 150, Your Honor, but nothing," she snapped. "I've heard enough." She turned back to Marcus. 150, and consider yourself lucky I don't suspend your license for wasting my time with excuses." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He just nodded once and turned to leave. And that might have been the end of it, just another small injustice in a system full of them, if the young public defender at the back of the room hadn't suddenly stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and firm, "before you finalize that ruling, there's something you should see." Judge Hart's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me." The public defender, a woman in her late 20s with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, walked to the front of the room, holding up her phone. "I just received this footage from the city's traffic cam archive. It shows the intersection in question at the time of the alleged violation." Judge Hart's expression darkened. "This is highly irregular. It's also highly relevant," the public defender shot back. She plugged her phone into the courtroom's display system, and a moment later, the screen at the front of the room flickered to life. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. It showed Marcus's truck approaching the intersection, slowing to a complete stop, waiting a full 3 seconds, and then proceeding. The overgrown branches partially obscured the sign, just as he said. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Hart's face went stony. The public defender didn't stop there. "And while we're on the subject of evidence," she said, pulling up another file, "this might also be of interest." The screen changed again, this time showing security footage from a restaurant across the street from the courthouse. The timestamp was from the previous week. Judge Hart was sitting at a corner table, deep in conversation with a well-dressed man. After a few minutes, he slid an envelope across the table. She picked it up, glanced inside, and tucked it into her purse. The gasps in the courtroom were audible. Judge Hart shot to her feet. "This is outrageous. How dare you?" But it was too late. The reporter sitting in the back row was already typing furiously on her phone. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. And Marcus, still standing at the defendant's table, just shook his head slowly. The courtroom had fallen into a stunned silence after the public defender's dramatic revelation. The air felt thick, charged with the weight of what had just been exposed. Every pair of eyes was locked onto the frozen image on the screen. Judge Evelyn Hart, caught in undeniable corruption, her fingers curled around an envelope of cash. The smug superiority she had worn like armor just moments earlier had shattered, replaced by something far more vulnerable: panic. Marcus Johnson stood perfectly still at the defendant's table, his expression unreadable. He had known the truth about his innocence from the beginning, but he had also known how little that truth would matter in a system that often saw him as just another faceless offender. Now, watching the judge's composure crumble, he felt no triumph, only a grim sense of validation. The system had failed him, just as it failed so many others, but today, for once, it had failed to protect one of its own. The public defender, a woman named Sarah Nguyen, didn't move from her spot in front of the screen. She had known the risks of what she was doing. Judges like Hart had long memories, and the legal community was small. But the moment she'd seen that traffic footage sent to her anonymously that morning, she'd known she couldn't let it go. And then, when she'd dug deeper, when she'd found the security tape from the restaurant, she'd known this was bigger than just one traffic violation. This was about exposing something rotten at the core of the system. Judge Hart's voice, when she finally found it, was nothing like the commanding tone she'd used earlier. It was shrill, desperate. This is a setup. That footage is doctored. I demand to know who's behind this." Sarah didn't flinch. "The footage is time-stamped and sourced directly from the city's archives, Your Honor. If you'd like, we can have it verified by an independent expert." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The reporters in the back were already on their phones, scrambling to break the story. One of them, a seasoned journalist named Lisa Carter, was recording every word. She'd covered Judge Hart's courtroom for years, had seen firsthand the way she treated defendants, especially those who didn't fit her idea of respectable. This was the kind of story that could blow the lid off the entire courthouse. The prosecutor, a man named Daniel Reeves, looked like he wanted to disappear. He'd worked with Judge Hart on dozens of cases, had even admired her no-nonsense approach until now. Now, he was realizing just how much of that approach had been fueled by something far uglier than efficiency. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, perhaps we should adjourn." "No." The word came from Marcus. It was the first time he'd spoken since the footage had played, and the quiet authority in his voice made everyone turn. "No adjournment. No delays. You were ready to throw the book at me 5 minutes ago over a stop sign. Now we've got proof of actual corruption, and you want to call it a day." Judge Hart's face twisted. "You have no right to speak to me like that." Marcus laughed, a short, humorless sound. "I've got every right. You just didn't think I'd ever use it." The tension in the room was a live wire. The bailiffs, who had been standing passively at the edges of the courtroom, shifted uneasily. They were used to maintaining order, but this was uncharted territory. Sarah seized the moment. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against Mr. Johnson. And given the evidence of judicial misconduct, I further move that this case be referred to the State Ethics Committee." Judge Hart's hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the bench to steady herself. "You insolent little..." Lisa Carter's voice cut through the room. "Judge Hart, do you have any comment on the allegations that you accepted bribes in exchange for favorable rulings?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine. For the first time in her career, Judge Evelyn Hart had no comeback. No clever retort. No way to spin this. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. And then, from the back of the courtroom, came the sound of the doors swinging open. A group of men in suits walked in, state investigators, their badges visible. The lead agent, a tall man with a grim expression, didn't even glance at Marcus or Sarah. His eyes were fixed on the judge. "Judge Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "you're under investigation for bribery and judicial misconduct. You'll need to come with us." The gasp that went through the courtroom was collective. Judge Hart's knees buckled. She caught herself on the bench, but the damage was done. Her empire of arrogance had fallen in the span of 10 minutes. Marcus watched as they led her away, her head bowed, her once impeccable robe now rumpled and askew. He felt no joy, no vengeance, just a weary satisfaction. The truth had won today. The moment Judge Evelyn Hart was escorted out of the courtroom by state investigators, the air itself seemed to crackle with a strange energy, part disbelief, part exhilaration, part raw uncertainty about what would happen next. The room, which had been so silent you could hear the rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats, suddenly erupted into a cacophony of voices. Reporters scrambled for the exits, already shouting updates into their phones. Lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently about the implications. And the spectators, ordinary citizens who had come for routine hearings, never expecting to witness something like this, stared at each other with wide eyes, as if unsure whether to cheer or simply sit in stunned silence. Marcus Johnson remained standing at the defendant's table, his hands resting lightly on its surface. He had been here as an accused man, humiliated and dismissed, and now, in the span of minutes, he had become something else entirely, an unwilling witness to the unraveling of a corrupt system. He didn't move right away. He let the noise wash over him, absorbing it, grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened. The judge who had sneered at him, who had treated him like a liar before he'd even opened his mouth, was gone. And yet, he felt no real victory. Just a deep, weary understanding that this wasn't really about her. It was about something much bigger. Sarah Nguyen, the public defender who had risked her career to expose the truth, was already being swarmed by reporters. She held up a hand, shaking her head, refusing to speak. Not yet. She needed a moment to think. She had acted on instinct, driven by a fury she hadn't even realized was simmering inside her until she saw that footage. But now, with the adrenaline fading, the weight of what she'd done settled onto her shoulders. She had just upended the entire power structure of this courthouse. There would be consequences. Across the room, the prosecutor, Daniel Reeves, stood frozen in place, his face pale. He had worked with Judge Hart for years. He had admired her. And now he was forced to wonder how many of his cases had been tainted by her corruption, how many defendants had been railroaded because she had already decided their fate before they even stepped into her courtroom. The thought made him sick. He turned to Marcus, as if searching for something, forgiveness, maybe, or at least an acknowledgement that he hadn't been part of it. But Marcus wasn't looking at him. His gaze was fixed on the empty judge's bench. Outside the courtroom, chaos was unfolding. The news was spreading like wildfire through the courthouse. Clerks abandoned their desks, rushing toward the commotion. Other judges peered out of their chambers, their expressions ranging from shock to thinly veiled concern. Because if Hart had been taking bribes, who else might be involved? The entire building seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Lisa Carter, the reporter who had been recording everything, was already typing furiously on her laptop, her article going live in real time. She knew this story was bigger than just one corrupt judge. This was about the system that had allowed her to thrive. The defense attorneys who had been too afraid to challenge her. The prosecutors who had looked the other way. The clerks and bailiffs who had seen her behavior and said nothing. This was about complicity. And then there was the footage itself. Who had sent it to Sarah? How had they gotten it? The security tape from the restaurant was one thing, maybe a whistleblower, maybe a disgruntled employee. But the traffic cam footage, that was harder to explain. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure Marcus Johnson's name was cleared. Someone had been watching. Marcus finally moved, stepping away from the table. He didn't look at the crowd as he walked toward the exit. He didn't want their questions, their congratulations, their sudden interest in his story. He just wanted air. But as he pushed through the doors, he found himself face to face with a man he didn't recognize, tall, dressed in an expensive suit, his expression unreadable. The man didn't speak, just held out a business card. Marcus hesitated, then took it. The card was blank except for a single word, justice. And just like that, the man was gone, disappearing into the crowd before Marcus could even process what had happened. He stared down at the card, his mind racing. Who was this? Another reporter, a lawyer, or something else entirely? Back inside the courtroom, Sarah was finally speaking to the press, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "This isn't just about one judge," she said. "This is about accountability. About making sure the people who are supposed to serve justice aren't the ones betraying it." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Because somewhere out there, someone had orchestrated all of this. And they weren't done yet. The aftermath of Judge Evelyn Hart's public disgrace sent shockwaves through the city's justice system like a seismic event, cracking open fault lines that had been carefully concealed for years. In the days following that explosive courtroom scene, what began as a single corrupt judge's downfall quickly spiraled into a full-blown institutional crisis that would permanently alter the landscape of power in the city. Marcus Johnson found himself at the center of a media storm he never asked for. News vans camped outside his modest home in the historically black neighborhood of Crestview, reporters shouting questions about his thoughts on justice every time he stepped outside. He refused most interviews, only granting one to veteran journalist Lisa Carter on the condition they meet at the small community center where he'd been mentoring at-risk youth for nearly a decade. "This was never about me," he told her, his deep voice measured but firm. "This is about every person who's ever walked into that courthouse expecting fairness and got treated like dirt instead." The quote would become the rallying cry for protesters gathering outside City Hall. The ripple effects came fast and hard. Within 72 hours of the courtroom incident, 3 more judges abruptly resigned, all known associates of Hart's from their law school days. The district attorney's office announced a sweeping review of every case Hart had presided over in the past 5 years, a process that would uncover dozens of questionable rulings where wealthy defendants received suspiciously lenient treatment. The restaurant where Hart had been filmed taking bribes was revealed to be owned by a real estate mogul currently facing racketeering charges Hart had been scheduled to hear the following month. Sarah Nguyen became both a hero and a pariah overnight. While civil rights organizations praised her courage, many of her colleagues at the public defender's office quietly distanced themselves, fearing professional repercussions. The State Bar Association received an anonymous complaint accusing her of unethical conduct for how she'd obtained the damning footage. She spent sleepless nights wondering if she'd just torpedoed her career, alternating between righteous certainty and bone-deep fear. "I'd do it again," she told Marcus when they met for coffee a week later, her hands wrapped tightly around the mug. "But I don't know if I'll ever practice law in the city again." Meanwhile, the mysterious business card Marcus had received continued to haunt him. His attempts to trace its origin led nowhere. No company by that name existed in state records. Then, exactly 7 days after the courtroom incident, a package arrived at his doorstep containing a thumb drive with hundreds of documents, emails between Hart and various city officials, bank records showing suspicious transfers, even recordings of phone calls discussing case fixes. Most disturbingly, there was evidence implicating not just judges, but several high-ranking police officials in the corruption web. Marcus immediately turned everything over to Lisa Carter, who published an explosive investigative piece that forced the mayor to call an emergency press conference. The public outrage reached a fever pitch. Protest marches swelled from hundreds to thousands, with chants of "No justice, no peace" echoing through the courthouse plaza where Hart had once held court. The U.S. Justice Department announced a federal probe into the city's entire judicial system. At a heated city council meeting, community leaders demanded not just resignations but systemic reforms, independent oversight of judges, mandatory body cameras for all court officers, a complete restructuring of how cases were assigned to prevent favoritism. In the midst of this upheaval, Marcus found himself becoming an unlikely symbol. He resisted the poster child role at first, uncomfortable with the spotlight. But when young black men kept approaching him on the street to share their own stories of courtroom discrimination, he realized his voice mattered. He began working with community organizations to establish a legal watchdog group, training ordinary citizens to monitor court proceedings and document irregularities. "We can't rely on mysterious whistleblowers to do this work for us," he told a packed town hall meeting. "Real change happens when the people most affected take power into their own hands." The final bombshell came 3 months later, when federal investigators uncovered evidence linking Hart's corruption network to an even wider circle of politicians and business leaders. The mayor's chief of staff resigned abruptly. 2 city council members announced they wouldn't seek re-election, and in a stunning reversal, the police union, which had initially defended all officers mentioned in the scandal, agreed to sweeping reforms after internal documents revealed systemic evidence tampering in cases Hart had overseen. As for Judge Evelyn Hart herself, she sat in a jail cell awaiting trial, her expensive suits replaced by an orange jumpsuit, her arrogant sneer gone. The woman who had once wielded her gavel like a weapon now spent her days being processed by the same system she'd manipulated for years. In a twist of poetic justice, her bail hearing was assigned to Judge Raymond Carter, the first black man to serve on the state's appellate court, a juror known for his meticulous fairness. The courtroom was packed when Hart finally appeared, her hands cuffed, her eyes downcast. She said nothing when the charges were read. The once powerful judge had been reduced to just another defendant in the system. The reforms came slowly but steadily. A new community oversight board was established to monitor judicial conduct. The state legislature passed laws requiring full transparency in political donations from lawyers who appeared before judges. And in perhaps the most symbolic change, the courthouse where Hart had presided was renamed, not after some politician or dead white jurist, but as the Fair Justice Center, a name chosen by community vote. On the one-year anniversary of that fateful courtroom moment, Marcus Johnson stood on the steps of the renamed courthouse, addressing a crowd of supporters. He wasn't a lawyer or politician, just a man who'd refused to stay silent. "This building doesn't belong to judges or attorneys," he said, his voice carrying across the sunlit plaza. "It belongs to the people. And we'll be watching." The applause lasted nearly 5 minutes. Somewhere in the crowd, a young public defender named Saren Wen wiped away tears. And in the very back, a tall man in an expensive suit watched with quiet satisfaction before slipping away unnoticed, another blank business card tucked in his pocket. The system hadn't been perfect. It still wasn't. But for the first time in memory, people dared to hope that justice, real justice, might finally be possible. Not because those in power allowed it, but because ordinary people had demanded it. And refused to back down.